Before we get started with the episode, I do want to make some statements regarding the topic of my last episode. First of all, thank you for listening and engaging with that episode. I can't remember the last time I got that many comments, emails, questions about an episode. In some of the messages I got, people expressed concern that I would be attacked or harassed. Some of the concern was joking and some was serious. And I do want to say that that's not happening anywhere I'm aware of. That said, I did receive one message that disturbed me. It was not negative to me, but it was a link to a podcast episode that LaDonna Humphrey's co-host David McClam made. I was not aware of this episode before I released mine, or I would have re-recorded and spoken out then, because David kept making statements like how he would have 25 years ago shown up at Javier's door and beat him up. But he wouldn't do it now because he's changed. But then he would double back and say he knew where Javier lived and had people in the area who would do it for him. Just one phone call if he got mad enough. He was couching what I saw as direct threats in between these vague, oh, but I wouldn't do it, denials. David McClam went on to threaten Anthony Christopher, not just Anthony, but his current business, which is a gay bar that hosts drag shows. David said he and another friend of LaDonna's have been contacted by the Westboro Baptist Church about doing something to Anthony and his business, putting not just Anthony at risk, but his patrons as well. David said if they got approached by a gay person, a drag queen, or someone they think is transgender, there would be a, quote, bloodbath. Again, David followed it up with, well, he wouldn't mobilize them, but it did cross his mind. He did the whole, I wouldn't do it, but I could, back and forth. This episode was so clearly threatening that his podcast hosting service removed the episode. If you're not in podcasting, you may not realize how rare that is for a hosting service to pull an episode like that. Think of all of the offensive things you have heard on podcasts, and every last one of those is still up. That tells you how many lines this episode crossed. On my podcast, every week, I expose the effects of violence, but unfortunately, it's after someone has already been killed. This is happening not just in real time, but within my own community, within our true crime podcast community. How many cases have we seen here on Crimelines where people witness an escalation, but they don't realize what they're seeing until it's too late? I'm not going to wait until someone gets hurt to denounce the dangerous and violent rhetoric within my own community. This is not okay, and Anthony and Javier have my full support as they protect themselves and their families and pursue this through legal channels. And with that, let me calm down and get on with our regularly scheduled episode. Irasema Chavez's killer was seen on security camera and left DNA behind, but the case has remained unsolved for nearly 13 years. How is that even possible? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This is the second Wednesday, so we are looking at a cold case. This one is unsolved, but it has some very solid clues, as you heard in the introduction, and it is ready for someone to call in the right tip. I put my episodes up on my website with images and timelines for anyone who wants to see them, but I don't announce it in every episode because it's not usually necessary for the case. But I am going to announce it in this episode because there are visuals there that you may want to see, and I obviously cannot put them on the screen because I don't have a screen. All we have is my marginally tolerable voice. My podcast is Basement Fort Productions, and I will leave a link to the specific episode for my website in the show notes so you can find it easily. This is a case that has not gotten a lot of coverage. Deanna Boyd with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did a podcast episode on it in 2018, and you can find it by searching for Out of the Cold podcast or by checking my sources, which are also linked in my show notes. She also did a companion article for the newspaper, and that's really the most in-depth coverage this case has gotten, which is really a shame because the evidence here makes it solvable if they could just get a little bit more. Because of the lack of available information, this episode is a little bit shorter, but it really, really needs to get out there into the public. Let's go ahead and get started and bring some attention to this case. We are going to start with Irasema Chavez, who was born in 1979, and she grew up in the Monterrey, Mexico area, one of 6 children. This is the second time I've covered the case of someone from this area. If you go back to December of 2023, I covered the case of Debani Escobar. But this case didn't actually happen in Mexico because Irasema immigrated to the United States in her 20s. She was following her sister Diana, who had moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area with her husband in roughly 1998. It was on a trip to visit them that Irasema fell in love with the area and decided to join them permanently. She ended up living with her sister Diana and her brother-in-law Muhammad until she could find work and her own place to live. And Irasema was eager to have her own apartment, in part because she was ready for some freedom. Diana was her sister, not her mother, but she really did try to look out for Irasema as she acclimated to a new country, and that may have come across like more supervision than Irasema wanted at the time. Diana and Mohammed did feel like Irasema was too trusting, and that wasn't a good thing when she would go out places like to the clubs. She loved to dance, and she would go to the Tejano clubs with her friends, where she would meet new people. Irasema had developed a very tight-knit circle of friends, about a dozen people, who she would go out with. They were almost always together, and it would be unusual to see Irasema out without at least some of those people with her. But like I said, her sister and brother-in-law worried that she was too trusting, not necessarily of the people in her circle, but those outside of it. There was another reason Irasema wanted her own space. She was actively dating, and Diana did not know at the time that Irasema was a lesbian. Apparently, Diana's husband, Mohammed, knew, but Irasema worried that her sister wouldn't approve, so she didn't tell her. She certainly didn't feel like she could bring a girlfriend around at that point, so in order to start living her life more openly, Irasema needed her own place. And she found that place in Arlington, Texas, which is in between Dallas and Fort Worth. The apartment complex was in a solidly residential area, meaning it was nice and quiet, and it gave Irasema the space that she wanted/needed. She was living there in January of 2012 when her 17-year-old niece, Yessie, came to Texas for a visit. On January 18th, Yessie spent the night at Irasema's apartment and had lunch with Irasema and her girlfriend, who I will call Julia, and then after lunch, Yessie went back to Diana's house for the night. The night Yessie left Irasema's apartment, meaning Thursday, January 19th, Irasema called Diana around 9:30. She asked if Diana and Yessie would come over to her place and spend the night with her. Diana's husband was in Mexico at the time, and she did not like driving at night, so she didn't want to drive over there and said no. Irasema insisted a bit, so Diana offered for her to come to Diana's place instead for this sleepover. Diana did not get the impression that Irasema was upset or scared or really had any reason to not want to be alone that night. It seemed like she just wanted company, but she didn't want it bad enough to sleep over at Diana, so she turned down the invite. The family would later find out that Irasema had a falling out with her girlfriend that day, so that may have been why she wanted the company. She wanted a bit of a distraction. Later that night, Diana did call Irasema again, but she didn't answer. She just assumed Irasema was annoyed that she wouldn't come over there and was just purposely ignoring her call. The next morning, on Friday, January 20th, Diana had to go to work, so Yessie was going to spend the day with Irasema. Diana pulled into the parking lot of the complex and watched as Yessie went into the apartment. Even though Yessie had a key to let herself in, she found that the door was unlocked. As Diana was pulling out of the parking lot to go to work, she heard yelling, so she looked and saw Yessie running towards her, screaming. Yessie told her something was wrong with Irasema. When she went into the apartment, she saw blood everywhere, and she looked around to see what was going on, and that's when she found Irasema face down on the floor in the space between the kitchen and the dining room. Diana went into the apartment to see what was going on. She saw what Yessie did, and she ran out screaming. The neighbors, who were alerted that something was wrong by all of this yelling, called 911. One of the homicide detectives at the scene told Deanna Boyd with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that Irasema had been stabbed so many times that he thought she was wearing a mesh shirt. That's how many stab wounds there were. As would be expected in a case like this, there were signs of a struggle in the apartment, with the dining room chairs near Irasema's body knocked over. The investigators checked with the neighbors to see what, if anything, they heard, and Irasema's downstairs neighbor said that they did hear a thump late at night, but that was it. It just sounded to them like a chair falling over. They didn't hear screaming or yelling or even vague arguing, and they didn't see anyone come or go from the apartment. There was one thing missing from this crime scene. Irasema's flat-screen TV that was normally in her living room was gone. But even though something was stolen, it seemed highly unlikely that this was a robbery gone wrong. The medical examiner determined that Irasema had been stabbed over 100 times, with several of those wounds being made post-mortem. She was already dead, and her killer kept stabbing her. This was such a rage killing with so much overkill that it seemed impossible that it was just over a TV. The investigators believed the TV was taken for a different reason. And to explain it, we need to take a couple steps back. Irasema's truck had been broken into while it was parked in the complex's parking lot. She decided to install security cameras, one that pointed to her parking space and one that pointed at her front door. Irasema would often have the camera feed just playing on her TV if she wasn't watching something, and it was mostly just so she could keep an eye on her truck. It wasn't that common for people to have security cameras at apartments back in 2012. It's believed the killer was not aware that there would be a camera and saw the footage playing on the TV when they came inside. Realizing that they may have been caught on camera, they unplugged the TV and took it with them, not realizing that it's not the TV that stored the footage. It only displayed it. It was the DVR attached to the TV that recorded, and that was left behind. And this is the visual I wish I could show you because we do have some security footage that has been released. Again, it will be on my website, basementfortproductions.com, so that you can see it if you're in a position where you can go watch something. I will do my best to describe to you what we see in this video. Not a lot happens, so it's not that hard to explain. For starters, the video released is of the front door camera, and it lasts for 1 minute and 24 seconds. This camera is not a Ring-style doorbell camera positioned on the door so it's facing the person. It's actually perpendicular to that. So when someone is standing at the door facing it, you're going to see their profile. What we see is someone walk up the stairs towards Irasema's apartment, but they're coming from the direction of the camera, so we're seeing their back. They then turned and took a few steps to Irasema's door and knocked on it at 11:29 p.m. on January 19th, 2012. As they were standing facing her door, we are getting a profile shot of them, or their body at least. They had a hoodie on with the hood up and possibly a baseball cap. This mostly obscures their face. But even when it looks like they moved the hoodie back a bit, it's still hard to make out the features since this is not the best quality camera, particularly in the dark. This person knocked a couple of times, but it was over a minute from the first knock until they were let in. And when they stepped into the apartment, they did so calmly. They didn't force open the door when Irasema answered it or charge in or anything like that. They just stepped into her apartment. There is no audio on this recording, so any conversation Irasema had with this person either before or after the door was opened is just unknown. We also don't know when they left the apartment because about 10 minutes after they arrived, the camera feed was disconnected. It was likely done as they were disconnecting things to take the television, and since the security camera was taken offline while this person was in the apartment, it's pretty clear that the person at the door was the killer. The police released this footage in August of 2012, 7 months after Irasema's murder. They were asking for the public's tips. Even though the face couldn't be made out, the way they walked up the stairs and approached the door, that might be familiar to someone. The investigators, when releasing this footage, referred to the suspect as a man, and this was an assumption they had made based on the masculine walk and build. But this wasn't a man. This was a woman, and we know that because of the DNA found at the scene. There was a lot of blood at the scene, as you can imagine, in a stabbing with more than 100 wounds. And it's not uncommon for people to cut themselves in stabbings. As the knife gets wet, it gets slippery. But it seems like it would have been almost impossible to find someone else's small amount of blood in there because there was so much of Irasema's blood. Where do you even start testing? Well, you start with the blood that is where it shouldn't be. And one of those out-of-place spots was a drop of fresh blood found on Irasema's nightstand. They sent it to the DNA lab and learned it was not Irasema's, but it was female. The assumption that the person at the door was a male was wrong. The investigators had gotten tips from some of Irasema's friends about her ex-girlfriend, the one I'm calling Julia. Some people told the police that Julia had sold drugs at the clubs, and while Irasema was not involved in that side of things, she was sort of connected because she was dating someone who was. And Irasema's niece, Yessie, had told the police about a conversation she had with Julia when she had lunch with her and Irasema on the day of the murder. They were talking about crime in Mexico, and Julia said something about being the niece of El Chapo, the infamous cartel leader. The stories of how many people El Chapo killed directly vary from dozens to thousands, but I mean, killing one person is too many, so it's just a matter of scale after that. Yessie was surprised to hear that Julia was related to a killer, so while they were talking about it, she asked Julia if she would ever be able to kill anyone. And Julia said no, but she has people who could do it for her. So the police have these stories of underworld ties, and Julia and Irasema had just had a falling out that day, and it made her someone they wanted to look into more. But Julia's DNA was not a match for the blood left at the scene, and the stories linking her to drugs or the cartel didn't seem to pan out when they were investigated. So Julia was cleared, but it seems almost certain that the person who left the DNA behind was someone that Irasema knew. She had the camera at the door, so she could have simply not answered it if she didn't know who was knocking, particularly seeing that it was nighttime. People who are security conscious enough to have cameras installed are less likely to open the door to someone they don't know at 11:30 at night. And the overkill also points towards someone Irasema knew. Over 100 wounds, many of them after death, that showed a rage and an anger that a stranger was unlikely to have. Unable to find a match for the DNA, in 2016, the police reached out to Parabon Nanolabs to develop a profile of the suspect, not through behaviors, but rather through their DNA. Parabon can take a DNA sample and run the genetic profile of it, looking for the likelihood of the person having certain features like blue eyes or freckles, and they have had some success with this. They have a bunch of cases on their website, but there are 3 that really stood out to me. One is a case from 1999 when 23-year-old Jennifer Watkins didn't come home from her job at Memorial Hospital in Colorado Springs. Her husband reported her missing, and 2 days later, Jennifer's body was found under a stairwell in an area of the hospital that was under construction. They found that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head and had been sexually assaulted. They used the semen left behind to develop a DNA profile, and in 2017, they submitted it to Parabon Labs to make a composite sketch based on the DNA. In August of 2020, a tip came in and pointed investigators in the direction of Ricky Sievert, a maintenance man at the hospital. Ricky had died in 2001 in a car accident, so they used a family member's DNA to determine that Ricky was likely the killer. This case is considered resolved, and the similarities between the composite DNA rendering and Ricky Sievert's actual photo are pretty striking. I'll have it up on my website so you can see it. Another case where this DNA snapshot was helpful to the investigation was a Jane Doe case. In June of 2017, a woman was found dead in Glen Burnie, Maryland. She was covered with a tarp and badly decomposed. There was little they knew about her other than that this victim was female and probably around 20 years old. In the fall of that year, the police reached out to Parabon to generate a possible image for the victim. Once they had that, they sent the composite snapshot along with the clothing and jewelry descriptions out to other departments. Baltimore police reached out and said that this matched a missing person they had, 26-year-old Shaquana Caldwell. She had been missing since May. In November of 2017, the identification was made and her boyfriend confessed to her murder. Now, the last Parabon case I wanted to highlight is one that really shows what these composites can do. In February of 2012, Troy and LaDonna French woke up to hearing their 19-year-old daughter Whitley screaming because there was a man in her room. Whitley was on the second floor and Troy and LaDonna's room was on the main floor. The man pulled out a knife and threatened Whitley, telling her to be quiet. But it didn't work, and he ran out of the room as she kept screaming. So he was running down the stairs away from Whitley's room while Troy and LaDonna were running towards the stairs to rush to their daughter's aid. So the Frenches and the intruder essentially met at the bottom of the stairs. And this intruder pulled out a gun and shot them both dead. However, the killer had cut himself on something, likely his own knife, and there was some blood left on the banister. So the investigators had the DNA of the killer, but no one they tested it against was a match. The police worked with Parabon to come up with the DNA composite snapshot, and the information on ancestry and features were nearly a perfect match for John Alvarez, who was Whitley's boyfriend. But they had tested him already, and it wasn't him. The composite rendering, though, looked just like his brother, Jose. That, however, seemed impossible because the YSTR testing showed that John and the killer did not share a father, and as far as Jose and John knew, they did. But we've seen it before. Someone's father may not be their father. We saw it in the Yarrow Gombriasio case that I covered in October of 2019, and then in the Sylvia Quayle case that I covered on my other podcast, Crimelines and Consequences. If you want to listen to other cases with genetic genealogy hiccups due to paternity, those are 2 to listen to. And it's a hiccup with paternity that is what happened here. John and Jose did not get their Y chromosome from the same man. Jose Jr.'s father was not Jose Sr. But Jose Jr. did turn out to be the man who left blood behind on the handrail at the crime scene, and he eventually pleaded guilty. So those are 3 examples of the Parabon snapshots helping in a case. And they do have more on their website. I'll say they're not all home runs as far as how people look. So we do have to remember that these composites are kind of like an artist's rendering. They're not photographs, and we can't view them as such. They're tools we can use to narrow our focus, but not necessarily enough to rule anyone out completely. The Parabon Labs composite of Irasema's killer does tell us that she is Latina, and she has light or fair skin. Her eyes are very likely to be brown or hazel, and her hair is either black or brown. She also likely has few or no freckles. The image that they generated was shown to Irasema's friends and family, but no one really recognized her. Some said she looked vaguely like someone they may have met at a Dallas nightclub once, but it's not like the DNA composite really shows distinguishing features like piercings or tattoos, so they weren't sure. Since they have the killer's DNA, you would hope the investigators would go the next step and work on forensic genetic genealogy to find the killer's family and then narrow it down from there. But that might be difficult in this case. There is a distinct possibility that Irasema's killer is either an immigrant or a first-generation American, because that is who she spent her time with, other Spanish speakers. So not only would the investigators need someone in the family to have uploaded their DNA to a database they have access to, they would then probably have to do investigations in another country, possibly Mexico, but really anywhere through Latin America. That's 600 million people in 33 different countries. I'm not going to say that forensic genetic genealogy won't work in this case, but it's a reminder of why we see so many of the genetic genealogy solves when we're talking about white perpetrators or white doe cases. More white people do DNA tests, and if you're white and your great-grandparents were all born in America, you're going to be a lot easier to find through forensic genetic genealogy. Those are just the numbers. Another issue in this case, based on ethnicity and possible nationality, is that fewer people may be willing to speak to the police. Whether they are here in the U.S. on a visa or not, anti-immigrant sentiment and a distrust of policing may leave people within this community unwilling to come forward. And if the killer was born in another country, she may have already returned there, making people left in the U.S. feeling like their tips aren't going to do any good anyway, so why get involved? So I want to make it clear to everyone listening that Crime Stoppers is taking tips on the case, and you can remain anonymous. They do not need to know who you are, because think about this. If this woman did this to Irasema, she could do it to someone else. You can protect other women and help find justice for Irasema by coming forward. If you recognize the composite, which will be on my website, or you have any information on the murder of Irasema Chavez, you can call the Arlington Crime Stoppers at 817-469-TIPS, TIPS, and all of this information will be in my show notes.